Something big just happened. For weeks, the country's been frozen, paychecks stopped, benefits halted, tension rising like a pressure valve is about to burst. But then, out of nowhere, the silence broke. A single order was given direct, final, and unmistakable. Airspace sealed over the Caribbean. F-35 seconds scrambled into formation. Naval vessels repositioned off Venezuela's coast, and at the same time, in U.S. cities, protesters clashed with ICE agents, trying to pull detainees from federal vans. Chaos on the streets, confusion in Congress, and panic spreading through the media. And through it all, one thing became clear. The so-called shutdown crisis wasn't just about government funding, it was about control. Because while opponents were focused on partisan drama, the administration was quietly executing a coordinated strategy against narco-terror networks that stretched from Venezuela to the U.S. border. A move that stunned critics, cornered protest leaders, and forced even Washington insiders to admit someone just outmaneuvered everyone. Let's break down exactly what just happened, what order Trump just gave, and how the protesters and their allies never saw it coming. Right now, we're watching one of the most intricate operations in recent political memory unfold in real time. It's day 31 of the government shutdown, and if you've been following along, you know things have reached a breaking point. Picture this. More than 13,000 air traffic controllers haven't seen a paycheck in over a month. Federal union workers, thousands of them, are in the same boat. Airports are operating on fumes. Safety inspectors are stretched thin. And then there's the issue that hits closest to home for millions of families, SNAP benefits, the food assistance program that helps put groceries on the table for over 40 million Americans. November 1st was supposed to be the day those benefits rolled out again. But the shutdown meant that for the first time in decades, families across the country were staring at empty mailboxes and wondering how they'd feed their kids. Now, think about what that does to a nation's psyche. When people can't rely on the basic functions of government, when safety, stability, and even food security are suddenly in question, frustration doesn't just simmer, it boils over. And that's exactly where we were. The pressure valve I mentioned, it was about to blow. But here's where it gets interesting. Because while the media was focused on the theatrics in Congress, the partisan finger-pointing, the endless debate over who was to blame, something else was happening behind closed doors. A decision was being made, one that would shift the entire landscape overnight. And when that decision came down, it wasn't a compromise. It wasn't a negotiation. It was an order. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where the rules felt like they were holding you back? Maybe you were trying to get something important done, helping a neighbor, organizing a community event, dealing with bureaucracy, and you hit a wall. Not because your idea was bad, but because the process itself was designed to slow everything down. That's what the Senate filibuster is, in a nutshell. It's a procedural rule that requires 60 votes to move most legislation forward. And in a divided government, that's a nearly impossible threshold to meet. So, what do you do when the clock is ticking? When millions of people are counting on you, and the old rules are grinding everything to a halt? You change the rules. That's exactly what Trump authorized. He gave the order to activate what Washington insiders called the nuclear option. Now, don't let the name scare you. It's not about actual weapons. It's about eliminating the filibuster for budgetary matters, allowing the Senate to pass a continuing resolution with just 50 votes plus the vice president's tiebreaker. In other words, it's about cutting through the gridlock. And before you think this is some radical new move, let me remind you, the nuclear option has been used before. In fact, it's been invoked by Democrats more than once in recent history. When they needed to push through judicial appointments or legislative priorities, they didn't hesitate. So when people clutch their pearls and say, but what if the other side uses this against us later? Well, they already have. And they promise to do it again the next time they're in power. So the question isn't whether this tactic will be used. The question is, who's going to use it first when it actually matters? Now, I want you to think about something for a moment. Leadership isn't just about making popular decisions, it's about making necessary ones. And sometimes, the necessary decision is the one that upsets the established order. Because the established order, if we're being honest, wasn't serving the people anymore. It was serving itself. And when you're dealing with a crisis that's affecting tens of millions of lives, you don't have the luxury of waiting for consensus. You act. That's what Trump did. He looked at the paralysis in Washington, the suffering spreading across the country, and the political games being played with people's livelihoods, and he said, enough. We're moving forward. And here's the thing, whether you agree with him or not, you have to admit this. It worked. The Senate moved. The gridlock broke. And suddenly, the conversation shifted from, will the government ever reopen, to what happens next. But, and this is a big but, the domestic political maneuvering was only half the story. Because while all eyes were on Capitol Hill, another battlefield was being set. And this one wasn't in Washington. It was in the Caribbean. Have you ever noticed how sometimes the biggest moves happen when everyone's looking somewhere else? It's a principle that applies to everything from business strategy to geopolitics. Distract your opponent with one hand while the other hand sets the real play in motion. And that's exactly what unfolded here. While the media was obsessing over the shutdown drama, interviewing furloughed workers, covering protest marches, dissecting every tweet the Pentagon was quietly mobilizing, airspace near Puerto Rico closed. F-35 fighter jets scrambled and stationed. Naval assets repositioned along key maritime corridors. And the focal point of all this activity? Venezuela. Now, if you've been paying attention to global affairs, you know Venezuela isn't just a troubled neighbor. It's a failed state run by dictator Nicolas Maduro, who's been propped up by foreign adversaries and narco-terrorist cartels for years. And those cartels? They're not just Venezuela's problem. They're ours. Because the drugs flowing out of South America don't stop at the border. They end up in American communities, destroying families and fueling violent crime. So when the Trump administration began positioning military assets off the Venezuelan coast, it wasn't a random show of force. It was a calculated message. And the message was simple. We know what you're doing, we know where you're operating, and we're not going to let it continue. Think about it like this. Imagine you're trying to stop a leak in your house. You can keep mopping up the water on the floor, or you can go find the source of the leak and fix it. For decades, policy has been focused on mopping up, arresting drug dealers, intercepting shipments at the border, treating addiction after it's taken hold. All of that is important, don't get me wrong. But it's reactive. What Trump ordered was proactive. He went after the source. Now, here's where the narrative gets even more layered, because this wasn't just about intercepting boats or sending a message to Maduro. This was about disrupting an entire ecosystem of narco-terrorism. And that ecosystem is more complex than most people realize. You've got cartels operating with military-grade weapons. You've got corrupt government officials facilitating smuggling routes. You've got terrorist organizations using drug profits to fund operations around the world. It's not just crime, it's a transnational security threat. And yet, when Trump ordered these strikes, when U.S. forces began taking out narco-terrorist targets in international waters, what was the reaction from some corners of Washington? Outrage. Accusations of illegality. Claims that the president was acting as judge, jury, and executioner. One lawmaker even went so far as to say Trump was applying the death penalty for drug dealing without due process. Let me pause here and ask you, do you think terrorists operating in hostile waters, killing Americans with drugs, deserve the same legal protections as U.S. citizens standing trial in a courtroom? Because that's the crux of the debate. On one side, you have people arguing for procedural purity. Every target needs to be vetted. Every strike needs congressional approval. Every action needs to follow peacetime legal standards. On the other side, you have people like Senator John Kennedy, who plainly said, these are terrorists. They're killing our children with drugs. They're just as dangerous as jihadists in the Sahel or Afghanistan, and the president is doing something about it. I think about this a lot, actually. The balance between ideals and survival. We want to believe that if we just follow the rules, everything will work out. But sometimes the people you're up against aren't playing by the same rules. And if you insist on tying your own hands while they operate freely, you're not being principled, you're being naive. That doesn't mean you abandon your values. It means you recognize that protection sometimes requires, and decisiveness in the fog of a real threat doesn't always come with a committee meeting and a press release. So, while critics in Congress were drafting strongly worded letters, Trump's order was already in motion. Strikes were being carried out. Smuggling routes were being disrupted. Cartel leaders were being eliminated. And the result? a measurable impact on the flow of drugs heading toward U.S. borders. Not a complete solution, nothing ever is, but a shift, a recalibration of power. And here's the part that really matters. Maduro, the dictator sitting in Caracas, suddenly found himself in a very uncomfortable position, because for years, he'd operated with impunity, knowing that the international community would wring its hands, but never act. Now he's watching U.S. military assets just off his coast, watching his narco-terrorist allies getting picked off one by one, and wondering if he's next. But even as all of this was unfolding on the global stage, the chaos back home was reaching a fever pitch, because while the Pentagon was executing surgical strikes in the Caribbean, ICE agents were conducting enforcement operations in American cities. And that's where the protesters come in. You've probably seen the videos by now. They went viral almost instantly. A group of activists, some genuinely concerned citizens, others professional agitators, surrounded an ICE vehicle in broad daylight. They weren't just protesting, they were actively trying to free a detainee who'd already been arrested for immigration violation. One person yanked open the vehicle door, others tried to pull the individual out, and in the midst of this, ICE agents had to make a split-second decision. Do we let this happen, or do we enforce the law? They chose enforcement. And what happened next became a flashpoint. Arrests, accusations of excessive force, outrage on social media. And here's the part that often gets overlooked, a clear demonstration of the consequences when activism crosses the line into obstruction. Let me be clear. I believe in the right to protest. I believe in free speech, in civil discourse, in holding power accountable. But there's a difference between protesting a policy and physically interfering with law enforcement officers doing their job. And that difference matters. Because the moment you try to forcibly remove someone from federal custody, you're not a protester anymore. You're breaking the law. And officers have a responsibility to respond. Now, here's what's fascinating from a strategic standpoint. These confrontations didn't hurt Trump's position. If anything, they reinforced it. Because for every viral video of activists clashing with ICE, there were millions of Americans, many of them moderate, many of them unsure about immigration policy, who looked at that chaos and thought, that's not okay. It became a visual argument for the very policies Trump was pushing: law and order, enforcement, consequences. And that brings me back to the original point. This entire sequence of events, from the nuclear option in the Senate, to the military operations near Venezuela, to the enforcement actions at home, wasn't a series of random reactions. It was a coordinated strategy. Each piece reinforced the others. The shutdown resolution demonstrated control. The Venezuela strikes demonstrated strength. And the enforcement actions demonstrated follow-through. You know, when I think about systems, whether it's a supply chain, a spacecraft, or a government, one principle always holds true. Alignment is everything. If your components are working at cross purposes, the system fails. But if every part is synchronized toward a common objective, you get something powerful. Something that moves faster and hits harder than anyone expected. That's what happened here. And while the media was scrambling to cover each individual story, they missed the bigger picture. This wasn't three separate crises. It was one operation executed on multiple fronts, and the people who underestimated that coordination, they got outmaneuvered. Now, the protesters weren't the only ones caught off guard, because while activists were clashing with federal agents in the streets, another battle was raging, and this one was fought with headlines, sound bites, and speculation. The media, to put it bluntly, went into overdrive, and in their rush to frame the narrative, they ended up doing something fascinating. They amplified the very confusion that worked in Trump's favor. Think about it. One network was running breaking news alerts about imminent military strikes on Venezuela. Another was interviewing constitutional scholars, debating whether the Caribbean operations were legal.